It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. It's Friday and it's time for our Agile Not So Agile episode of the Daily Stand Up Podcast. So I thought I'd talk about something today that is interesting, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it's regarding relationships. And I came across an article not too long ago that was talking about components of fulfilling a romantic relationship. And I thought, not appropriate for the podcast. But then I thought, how many of those would translate over into creating relationships and building relationships in an agile world? So, with that being said, I jumped in and I said, I'm going to capture these five and see where it takes me. So, for the sake of the episode title, I'm just going to call it the five C's. The five C's of building and maintaining relationships. And I think the key here is to understand that there's a backstory. So, with every good, with every good episode, there's always a backstory. So sometimes people just don't understand how complex emotions can be and how sometimes it's so hard to understand. We hear many guys who say women are complex and complicated. We hear many ladies say that men are too simple or they don't take the time to invest in a relationship. And I think a lot of this has to do with our behaviors. Now, part of this has to do with the way things have grown and transitioned over the last 15 to 20 years. The heavy involvement in social media, the heavy usage of cell phones and other portable devices where you have everything that you need at your fingertips. It's caused people to rely on credibility and facts instead of building relationships, intent, and driving things to a passion level. Now, one might argue that there are some crazies out there who, use social media and other tools to heavily seek out relationships and whatnot. But I think the greater emphasis needs to be on relationships and behavior patterns to include honesty, respectfulness, listening, integrity, and any other constructive exchange you can think of. But when people think, oh, well, that sounds easy, the truth is, it's not that simple. It's not easy for us to disengage from a device and invest in a person. It's not easy for us to disengage from social media and disengage from things that are going on around us and really try hard to build a relationship that means something, that makes a difference. And I think that in this day and age, a lot of people are going through other strains like psychological traumas, personal tragedies, backstory about families, mental dysfunctions, physical handicaps. We're just surrounded by people who are not whole. And I think this is something that has been around forever, but the emphasis on this is something that's brand new. So, what I'm going to go with here is I'm just going to jump straight into the five C's because I think if we start talking about the five C's, it's going to make a lot of difference. So, coming at number one is contentment. So, this is the ultimate measure of success in a relationship. Are you fulfilled? Do you feel productive? Do you feel enriched? And I logically could say that contentment could apply to a physical relationship as well as a work relationship. Are you happy doing what you're doing? Do you feel fulfilled? Do you feel productive? Do you feel enriched? I think that individuals tend to rate their own level of contentment most high when they view a relationship as having something that's a higher priority than themselves. When you put the relationship first and you make the relationship the winner, the individuals in the relationship are generally more happy. Makes perfect sense, right? So I think that if you can focus on contentment and finding ways to become content, it's going to help tremendously in any relationship. And I really do believe that people struggle with this because they want to be happy, but sometimes they settle. And I think that stress is a key driver of settling. So if we can find ways to reduce stress, that's going to help us to not settle. And it's going to help us to understand contentment and how we can be really content and what that's going to do for us. The next C I want to talk about is communication. Communication is, of course, articulating your thoughts in such a way that the other person understands them as intended. Obviously, this has to be a two-way street. The other party must also be able to interpret those expressions as intended. And I think this is one that kills me. This is one that I see in 99% of relationships where people struggle. They are not good at communicating with each other, whether it's verbal cues or physical cues. These people want things to be easy. And the truth is, with all the experience that I've seen, this skill is probably the hardest to master. When conflicts arise, people just don't go to agreement. They're not trying to agree, they seek out resolution. And I think that it's an important distinction because an agreement is like a temporary ceasefire, where a resolution is the let's get this thing solved. It has finality. And I think that's something that many people miss out on. Another one of the C's that I wanted to talk about, of course, is commitment. And I want to make sure I emphasize this because a lot of people don't think of commitment this way. Commitment isn't a noun. Commitment is, well, I guess technically it is, but it's a frame of mind. It could be a noun and a verb. Do we call that a nerb or a voun? A commitment minded person is someone who doesn't think about giving up a task before its completion or resolution. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a job, school, a hobby, project, relationship. The commitment mindset is what allows someone to complete their goals. So some tasks may get rough or uncomfortable, and somebody's level of commitment often dictates whether they're able to work through challenges. And this is what employers seek when you're looking for a job. They're looking for someone who can commit to the goal. And I remember recently hearing another podcast that I listened to, and they were talking about a gentleman who was seeking people for a high level executive position within his company. And he had two extremely highly qualified candidates. They both went to the exact same university. They both had the same degrees and backgrounds. They both graduated within 2 years of each other. They both had years of relevant experience. They both had a lot of philanthropical work. I mean, these two individuals couldn't have been cut more from the same cloth. They were almost exactly identical. So this gentleman decided he was going to take both of these guys out to eat, and he was going to, not for a formal interview, but he was just going to take them out for dinner to see if that would help him decide which person he wanted to engage with. And they had the dinner, everything went great. And at the end of the dinner, at the end of the meal, he thanked them both. And the thing that was ironic is that he didn't really ask him any type of interview questions. He just observed and had small talk with them throughout dinner. And as they left the restaurant, he pulled the two aside and he shook one of their hands and said, "I want to thank you for coming. I really appreciate your willingness to come and work for our company, but unfortunately, we're going in a different direction." And he shook the other person's hand and said, "Congratulations. How soon can you start?" And the first guy was quite confused. He was like, "Whoa, what just happened?" Right? And he turned back and he says, "I've got to know, what was, help me understand what I did wrong so that I can, course correct in the future." He said, "I felt like this dinner went very well." And he said, "In fact, it did." He said, "But there were two things that stood out to me." He said, "The first is when the server came to the table and engaged with us, he said one individual spoke with the server, treated her like an equal, laughed with her, and really enjoyed her company, where the other just treated her like a server." He said the second thing that stood out to him was when the server brought each of their steaks. He said one individual, the first guy, immediately grabbed salt and put salt on his steak. The second guy cut a steak, checked the temperature, tried a piece, and then added salt. Now, while that might sound so subtle and so random, those two things make a huge difference. When you're looking for people who meet commitments and who understand leadership, the first thing is that they have to be able to associate and communicate with people at their level. And that was the example with the server. The second one is the guy wasn't willing to try something new before he immediately tried to make it his own. He wanted to change it into what he thought it should be before he even gave the chef a chance to prove his credibility. And I thought that was such an interesting take because I'm not the guy to put salt on a steak immediately. I'll tell you what, I'm further from that than anything else. I'm the person who believes in giving everyone an opportunity or a chance before, prove me wrong, right? And I love that attitude of the second gentleman where he tried things first and he wasn't afraid to try something new. And I think that's a big part of commitment. Okay, let's move on. Compassion. So, just like commitment, compassion is also a frame of mind. It's more than just having a sense of another person. That's empathy. Um, Empathy, of course, is the ability to sense others, such as reading body language, sensing emotional changes, realizing how someone's behaviors affect another person. It's important to have compassion, but you need to synthesize it. You need to have some type of emotional bond with the other person that translates into tangible actions, like the waitress example. When relationships don't work, oftentimes it's because people don't exhibit compassion and they express bias. So oftentimes they try to put themselves in the other person's shoes without taking their own shoes off first. And they see things through a lens of bias. The next C is compatibility. Compatibility is probably the most straightforward. Do you have similar tastes, similar lifestyles, political or religious views, etc.? At the workspace, do you have similar goals, similar ambitions? And I think that sometimes when people have dominant personalities, especially if they're in leadership positions, they may seek other people who are more submissive or vice versa. I think it's important for us to understand that we need people who can associate and who can grow together and who can learn about how to interact at every level. Which brings me to my next C, which is chemistry. Now, chemistry is a wild card. Sometimes you just have to be around another person long enough to see if they hit all the right buttons, but it's not always a physical sense. Sometimes chemistry is just an emotional bonding. And I think that it's important to have chemistry with your friends. It's important to have chemistry with your coworkers. It's important to have chemistry with your teams. It's important to have chemistry with leadership. And I think that this is the C that's the most underrated because typically it's inconsistent. And when people are trying to rationalize everything in a relationship in order to get to a point of chemistry, you'll find that it's going to be a lot harder for them to relate to others. This is why in dating world people say dating is so hard, right? Chemistry is something that is really, really hard to come by. So, in quick recap, we have chemistry, we got compatibility, we've got compassion, we've got commitment, and of course, we started things off talking about communication. And I gave you a bonus C there as well. Where we're talking about contentment. And I think that if you can rock these C's, that this is going to help you navigate the seas of life. Boy, that was punny. That's going to do it for today's episode. I hope you have an amazing weekend. And I look forward to joining you again on Monday. And as always, I encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.